Well, hey out there, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our series that we've called Sacred Conversations. Today, I am pleased to welcome Carolyn Wakeman back to the series of conversations, and I'll say just a little bit more about why Carolyn and I are talking further in just a little bit. We launched these conversations back in March in order to enlist whatever spiritual and intellectual resources might be available to us in order to get through this pandemic with our bodies and our souls and our minds intact. And along the way, we also began initiating conversations about some of the more urgent ethical issues bearing down upon us. And there are few issues more important within American life, whether now or over the past 400 years, than the many issues surrounding race. I think it's safe to say that over the last 6 months, there has been a more widespread and sustained interrogation of this country's racial past and what that means for the present than there has been for decades now. It's brought turmoil and agitation in the streets. It's brought some agonized soul searching, and it's brought renewed attention to our national and our local history. As a pastor and as somebody deeply invested in questions of social ethics, I need to tell you that I consider those to be profound gifts, no matter how uncomfortable it may make some among us. I think it's vitally important to our moral, but also to our spiritual well-being to confront these issues head on. Now, before we go any farther, some of you might be saying, but Steve, it's Christmas. And how about talking about something a little bit different now? And to that, I say that embedded in the story of Christmas, in Matthew's gospel in particular, is this very uncomfortable story of the murder of the innocents, which doesn't often make it into Christmas Eve services. It doesn't make it into holiday greeting cards, but it is there in the Christmas narrative. That's part of the context for what it means for grace, for divinity to enter into the world. We grapple with the loss of innocent life. Some of you may also be saying, yes, but Steve, this is kind of getting to be an old topic now. This all happened back in May and June, and it's time to move on and to talk about something new. And to that, I simply say, we have only just begun. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. There's so much more that needs to be said, so much more that needs to be explored, so much more that we need to learn. Histories and stories that have been occluded, hidden from our sight for far too long. And anyway, that's what most of us tend to do when things get uncomfortable. We try to change the subject. But this is a subject that we dare not change. And I want you to know that I'm committed to wrestling with it for as long as we must, even if that takes a very, very long time. Which brings me to the subject of this conversation. Carolyn Wakeman, as most of you know, wrote an outstanding new history of our church community here in Old Lyme. It came out about a year ago, though because of the pandemic, it was only about a month ago that Carolyn was able to give a public talk about it, public, if you will, in this virtual space. And you can still listen to that conversation by finding it on our website. It's a really, really wonderful presentation filled with all kinds of interesting stories and facts about our community. But Carolyn has also been exploring the history of enslavement in Old Lyme. And her discoveries are illuminating and also harrowing. And I want to say right now that I have been very privileged to learn some of those stories from Carolyn. And I wanted all of you to be able to learn what she's discovered as well. And rather than me simply recounting what I've learned from Carolyn, it seemed far better to have her share some of those discoveries directly via a conversation like this. And so, Carolyn, I will simply say to you, thank you for agreeing to do yet another of these conversations. You are now our most frequent guest on the Sacred Conversation series. And let me just thank you in advance for the just powerful research that you've undertaken so that we all might, as they say, learn the stories of those who were enslaved in the town of Lyme and Old Lyme, and to say their names. This is a history that we desperately need to grapple with. So, again, Carolyn, thank you, and it's good to have you back doing this conversation. A couple of months ago, I guess it was back in September, I reached out to you and asked, would you be willing to visit for maybe an hour and just tell me a few of these stories? And I imagine that we could accomplish most of what we needed to accomplish in an hour's time. And it turns out we barely scratched the surface because you've uncovered so much about these lives that have for too long been unknown. So I'm wondering if you could start by telling me how you came to be doing this research and how you came to be invested in this topic.
Well, sure, Steve. Thank you very much, first of all, for such a wonderful introduction and for placing this topic and our conversation, our return to a second conversation, for placing that in such an important context for everyone, even at Christmas time.
Yeah.
Where did it all begin? Well, it had, like all things, many beginnings.
Yeah.
First of all, as you know, I grew up in the town and I went all through school here. My parents, my grandparents, all the way back. I'm the 11th generation of my family to grow up in Lyme, and I've always been fascinated by the history of the local past. So that's not new. What's new is that I came back and settled full time permanently here about 15 years ago and decided that I would tackle some questions about local history that I'd not been able to answer for myself now that I had time once I was retired and could really begin to focus on this. So, one of the beginnings relevant to this conversation, one of the places where this exploration, this interrogation of the past, as you so wisely state, one of the places it began is next door to your office in what I still call the parish house upstairs, where there are a number of filing cabinets filled with old documents and a whole lot of stuff, some of it clutter and some of it just invaluable early manuscripts from the early 19th century. So with Betsy Webster, the other of your church historians, I went through those files and started to figure out what was in them. And there are just little tidbits, and all of it begins to fit together into a very complicated and very large picture. So that's I guess one place that it started. What I wanted to mention is that in all the books and pamphlets that I read about the town as I was growing up and after I came back, I took them from my mother's shelf and she'd taken them from my grandmother's shelf, and I went back through all of them, and I still knew nothing about slavery in Lyme. I did not know that there had been slaves in Lyme, and it was such a revelation to me, and so shocking that I had grown up here and had not known anything about this very important and complicated past, that I decided I really wanted to pass that information on. I wanted to explore it and document it and tie it down, figure out what really did happen here, and then share it so that other kids growing up here and others in the community would have, I think, a broader and much more comprehensive overview of what this town is about and what it's become today.
Right. Um, so one of the assumptions that I have carried with me forever, and I think most people have carried with them, is that while the North may have had a past in which slavery existed, it was by far a less violent, a less oppressive past than, say, in other parts of the country. And I feel like I have had the veils removed from my eyes regarding that issue. And one of the things that has done that for me is one of the stories that you shared right away in that first meeting. And so I'm wondering if you would talk about the story of Jane. She was somebody that showed up in your history of the church, and And yeah, I'm wondering if you would just talk a little bit more about what you discovered about her life, and then we can go from there and you can tell more about some of the lives that you've uncovered.
Good. Yes, I'd love to talk about Jane and then put her in a bigger context, because taking her out of context isn't really the best way to view her. But let's take her out of context first. I learned about Jane just from reading through the land records in the Lyme Town Hall. The Old Lyme records are all there up until the year 1855, when Lyme and Old Lyme separated into two distinct towns. So anything before 1855, any documents appear in Lyme. So slaves were considered property, just like livestock or tools or any other movable estate, and so they appear in the land records because they're considered property. So I was reading along and stumbled on a deed of sale for a child named Jane. She's a mulatto child. She was sold in 1729, I think, if my memory is right, when she was 3 years old. And we have the price that she was sold for. The whole document is there. And so I transcribed it. And it was shocking to me that out of a Lyme home, a home that in fact is on Lyme Street, Upper Lyme Street, that someone would be selling a child. But that's actually not surprising. I realize now that was early in my study. And of course, people were selling children, and a lot of people were buying children, and slaves were being bred for the children that they would create as a source of labor, but also as a source of revenue. And that's a hard truth for us to think about, but it's true. Now, I'm not saying that's true of Jane. I'm just saying that's the situation that existed, more so in the South, perhaps, because of course we can't know. When the woman whom I think was Jane's mother, went on to have 5 other children, did her owner, whose name is Richard Lord, she was then in Tannamahay, which is a section of town on the Neck Road adjoining the Connecticut River. Was there any coercion or encouragement, let's say, for Jane to have children, or would she have had the same number of children anyway? We can't know. Probably she would have had the same number of children anyway. I'm certainly not alleging that, but I'm just saying that there were a lot of children born into enslavement in Lyme. And if they were born to a woman who was enslaved, then they too were enslaved for life. Hereditary enslavement was something that you inherited from your mother. So that's a circumstance with Jane. She was sold to a man named Benjamin Reed. I tried to find more about Benjamin Reed and more about what happened to Jane, and I haven't been successful yet. I've looked pretty hard, but that doesn't mean I won't still find it. Benjamin Reed lived in North Lyme, and his father, John Reed, was involved with the seller, Joseph Peck Jr.'s father, Joseph Peck. The two of them were involved in cutting and selling timber that would be milled at the sawmill into barrel staves that would be floated down the rivers and the Lieutenant River to reach a warehouse and a vessel that would carry them, out elsewhere to be purchased. And many of those barrel staves went to the West Indies. Many of them went to Barbados because people needed barrels for rum and for sugar and for molasses and so on. So that's Jane. She was sold at age 3, and I don't know what happened to her after that. I know a little bit about her mother, or the woman I think was her mother, because there was a 20-year-old woman who was enslaved in the same household at the time that Jane was born. And Jane's name is the same name as that enslaved woman's mother. In other words, the woman whose name is Temperance seems coincidentally, it doesn't seem like just a coincidence to have named this child Jane after her own mother, Jane. And her own mother, Jane, I know this is complicated, but bear with me for 1 minute. Her own mother, Jane, we know from the records, was captured as a child of 2 in King Philip's War and sold as a slave. So the mother is a Narragansett Indian, according to the records that I've seen. These are secondary records, but I think they're reliable. So Jane was therefore a mulatto child because her mother was half Indian and her grandmother was a Narragansett. So all those details are interesting, and they help me to understand not just what seems to us so cruel and so shocking about enslavement in Lyme, but also the bigger picture, not just about Jane, but about other families and other children. And before I leave this family, one more detail that I think is important is that after Richard Lord bought Temperance, Jane's, I think, mother, Temperance was married the next week to a slave named Oxford, who was enslaved to Richard Lord. That marriage was performed by our first minister, Reverend Moses Noyes. And I've forgotten how many years later, 5 or 6, not very many, but maybe it was a few more than that. Anyway, Richard Lord sold Temperance, the mother, and Oxford, the father, along with their 7-month-old infant, whose name was Joel, to a buyer in Colchester. And that left the other 4 children of Temperance and Oxford, who would be Jane's half siblings, that left them enslaved without parents on the farm of Richard Lord in Lyme. So it's a complicated story, and it's, to me, it's, has elements that are really quite horrifying because of children being sold away from the parents and parents being sold away from their children and so on. But that's the reality of what happened, not just here but everywhere.
Yeah. Part of what made that story so poignant for me was imagining this mother who likely, I mean, we think, would have had her 3-year-old daughter sold out from her. And then to consider that this happened all over again when she and Oxford were sold, and she had to leave, we think, what, 4 children behind?
Mm-hmm.
So that it happened to her twice that we know about is heartbreaking in a way. And it captures the, not only the well, I'll just say it captures the horror of the whole system that we're describing.
Yes, that's right. When
Yeah.
human beings were property and their family ties were not considered, or at least not primarily considered. And as far as we can see, I mean, what could have been the reasons for Richard Lord selling Temperance, Oxford, and Joel? Well, he had 4 enslaved children who were growing up and who would already and would soon be able to do the burden of the agricultural labor and perhaps the kitchen labor on his property. So perhaps he didn't need them. I mean, we can't know why he sold them at that point. Why did he sell them? Why didn't he keep the family intact? But for whatever the reason was, he didn't.
Right. I think also in that story we capture kind of a whole world in some ways. So we captured the history of kidnapped Africans, for starters. We capture the history of breeding human beings in captivity and selling them as property. We capture the history of the native populations, the Narragansett populations, and how they were enslaved as well. And then we capture this economic relationship. And when you talked about the timber staves that were harvested and then sold down the river, many of which would have gone to the West Indies. We have in that one story, I think, so much of the history of New England.
Yes, that's right, Steve. I just want to return to that word breeding. I'm a little uncomfortable with the word because it may be too strong. I think we can't necessarily use that. I've used it, but maybe I used it unwisely. So I just want to put some quotation marks around that and say that for whatever reason, Temperance and Oxford had, as far as we know, 5 other children.
Yeah. Okay, so describe to me where that would have been in town.
Where? Okay.
Yeah, where.
And the other thing that I'd like to describe to you some other sort of clusters or networks
Yeah.
of enslaved people in town. So this Joseph Peck, as far as I can tell, lived in the adjoining in a homestead in the property adjoining that of Reverend Noyes at on the west side of what is today Upper Lime Street. So if you know the town, it's just west, just east of where Sill Lane and Lime Street intersect. So that's where Reverend Noyes' homestead was, and it extended quite far south. And the land adjoining that was owned by Joseph Peck Jr., given to him by his father. And so his homestead was somewhere, we're told by an earlier Old Lyme historian that it was approximately across from the Bee and Thistle Inn. So the sale of Jane when she was 3, and Temperance, when Temperance was 20, took place in that on that property, in that out of the home or the land of Joseph Peck Jr. But Joseph Peck Jr. had at least one other enslaved person, and in the Connecticut State Library, I looked through an account book that, in fact, 2 account books that Joseph Peck Jr. Left behind, and they include two references to his hiring out a Black boy. And in one instance, he hires out a Black boy for 1 day, and he gives the amount that he charged. And the other instance, he hired out a Black boy with a harrow for 1 day. So the boy was obviously doing agricultural work for others, and Joseph Peck Jr. was being paid for that labor. And then the last record involving Joseph Peck Jr. that I found is the death of his his manservant, whose name I believe was Jack, in 1738, and that's noted in the church records. So here we find a cluster. We have Jane, we have Temperance, we have the Black boy, assuming that it was just one boy, which it probably was, and we also have Jack. Now, Jack could have been the Black boy grown up, or grown up enough to have fathered the child Jane. So it's certainly conceivable that Jack was Jane's father, and it's not for sure. We can't pinpoint that, but it's a possibility. So we know that Joseph Peck Jr. was engaged in the sale of slaves. He did sell 2 slaves, no question, and he had at least one other enslaved person. And if Jack and the Black boy being hired out, if that's not the same person, if those are different people, then we know of 4 enslaved people that he owned.
Yeah.
So that, you said where? That's on Upper Lime Street, and we can look at the site of that of his house today. So we know pretty much exactly where it was. Therefore, it's not surprising that Reverend Noyes would have married Temperance, since Reverend Noyes and Joseph Peck Jr. were neighbors. Reverend Noyes probably knew Temperance, and then that raises all kinds of wonderful but unanswerable questions. Well, Reverend Noyes had an enslaved Black woman named Arabella. Could she have been related to Temperance? Was there any connection between them, or are they totally separate? These are just things that we can muse about. We'll never be able to answer them, but the questions themselves, I think, add significantly to our understanding of the network of enslavement in Lyme. So we need the answers, but we also need the questions that we can't answer.
Right. All right, so let's use that metaphor, that image of a network, and keep on talking about other clusters. I mean, you mentioned that other clusters existed that you're aware of, that you know about.
Let's talk for a minute about what you mentioned with the barrel staves, and what I mentioned also. And let me stick with, we had I think it was Richard Cheney, who popularized, or no, I guess it was his Secretary of Defense, who talked about the known unknowns. So we can talk about the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns. But this cluster, let's just start with Joseph Peck. This cluster has a longer beginning. His father, Joseph Peck, who was Reverend Noyes' first deacon, the first deacon he, as far as we know, that he selected in the church sometime maybe around, well, we don't know exactly when, sometime after 1693. Joseph Peck was from the colony of New Haven, and he was an important merchant there in New Haven. He was particularly involved in the fur trade, the fur coming down from Springfield and even farther north and through Windsor and Hartford down to Lyme, where furs could be shipped out. They were very popular, in demand in London and parts of Europe and so on. Joseph Peck Jr. grew up in a merchant household, and his sister Hannah married a man named Thomas Anderson, and Thomas Anderson moved to Lyme onto an adjoining piece of property, married to Joseph Peck Sr.'s daughter Hannah. So I'm just saying Joseph Peck Jr. and Hannah are brother and sister, and Thomas Anderson is a brother-in-law. And Thomas Anderson is an early school teacher in town, and he's also the tavern keeper. The tavern was then called an ordinary, and he was the ordinary keeper. And in 1701 or something, I have it written down, but I won't rummage through my notes right now. He was given liberty, meaning opportunity, by the town. It was a vote that he could sell 100 gallons of rum by the by the gallon and by the quart. That was the wording in the town records book. So we know that Thomas Anderson, whose property adjoins that of Joseph Peck Jr., where Temperance and Jane and Jack are enslaved, is selling rum from his tavern. And so that raises all kinds of questions for us. So where did the rum come from? And who brought the rum, imported the rum into town? And who was loading that rum on and off of whatever vessel it was being brought in on? And did Thomas Anderson have slaves? Or did he use his brother-in-law's slaves as labor? Or who was doing the work? And so, this is just a way of extending the questions to make us recognize that these clusters are very significant, and they involved, I think, actually many, if not most, of the early families in Lyme. Everybody was involved in the trade that sustained the British colonies, not just here, but elsewhere. And so, Steve, the network is much bigger. I mean, we look at the network in Lyme, but it's really a very big network, which is why this project of trying to trace the history of enslavement in Lyme is actually quite a large project, because people in Lyme traded in Boston, and they traded farther north. They traded in Maine, and they traded up the river in Springfield and in New York and on Long Island, and then further south, the coastal trade, as we think of it, in Virginia, the Virginia colony, where of course there were also slaves, and then down to Barbados and the West Indies. And some days I think, all roads from Lyme lead to Barbados. I just keep running into Barbados over and over again. It was a British colony. Slaves were there early, and there were a lot of ties between Lyme residents and those islands, especially Barbados.
Yeah. I remember I at one point tried to have you pinpoint. I guess I just wanted to know or to hear how much of the wealth of Lyme and Old Lyme depended upon that trade with Barbados, which was a plantation economy, a sugar plantation economy, wholly dependent upon slavery. And at that point, when I asked, you said, probably most of it, all of it. I don't know if that would still be true based on what you've
I think that is true, because what were the primary commodities that were being imported that were needed in Barbados to sustain the slave-run plantations? They needed horses to turn the wheels, and we know that way back to Matthew Griswold I and William Waller and others of the original settlers on the east side of the Connecticut River, they all had horses, and their horses had earmarks so that they could be differentiated one from another. And I saw a record in the Lyme land records in 1666. The year is important for us because it's the year that Reverend Noyes first came, and the year that we first had a minister in our town. But that same year, we first had a minister, a man named William Lord, who was Richard Lord's father, the one who bought Temperance. William Lord there's a record of his vessel shipping out horses to Barbados in 1666 in exchange for rum. So that trade was going on early, and it was going on before Lyme was separated as a town from Saybrook. That separation was in 1665, but the trade on both sides of the Connecticut River from Saybrook preceded that separation. And then, Steve, just one other note, that because I'm going to bring this conversation occasionally back to you and to me, my own family, John Huntley, my ancestor, my father's name is Huntley, so that's my maiden name. John Huntley came to Lyme, settled here in 1661, and his homestead was on what's now the main street. His farmhouse was on the site of the present library. And as far as I know, he did not own slaves. He had 200 acres of land or so on the east side of Lyme Street, all the way over to Duck River. But he got here by a circuitous route that I think illustrates this network, the network that stretched across the Atlantic world. John Huntley left, he was from Scotland, but he left from England, and he went first to Barbados, where I think a brother, not just I, but it's thought that the person named William Huntley in Barbados could have been, and perhaps was, John Huntley's brother. And William Huntley stays in Barbados. He dies there, and he has two slaves in his inventory. But John Huntley, the ancestor who came to Lyme, moves up to Virginia and stays in Virginia for a while. And then he moves to Boston. And there are several records of him during his years in Boston. He was in Boston for quite a few years. And he on one occasion, shipped dried fish from Boston, from the Boston area to Barbados. And then by 1661, he comes to Lyme. Well, why? He seems to have been rather successful, or at least established in Boston. His wife joined the Roxbury Church. There are quite a few records of him during that period. Anyway, he comes to Lyme, and we also know that he was a cooper. That means he was a barrel maker. That was his trade. That was his craft. So while he established a farm here, which I'm sure, he must have had stock and so on, we don't know that for sure. Whether he continued his trade as a cooper, making barrels that could be used for the trade with sugar and molasses and rum or not, I don't know. I haven't found any records, but it seems likely that his trading contacts in Barbados, in Virginia, in Boston would still have been of use to him in Lyme. At any rate, I'll end my family story quickly, but John Huntley dies in 1676, and his grandson or great grandson, James husband, is the only person in the Huntley family that I found who actually did own a slave. And Jack Huntley owned a slave named James. James Huntley owned a slave named Jack, and we know we can see him in several of the records. And there's also a gravestone that many of you may have noticed if you've wandered in Duck River Cemetery. It's quite near the entrance in the old part of the cemetery, sort of up on that little rise when you first walk in. It's a gravestone marking the grave of a Captain Michael Huntley, and Michael Huntley died in 1818 at the age of 14 on a voyage back from Martinique. So I can see the network in which my family was engaged from 1661 to 1818, and most of the early families in Lyme have similar show similar patterns.
Right. And these weren't folks going to the West Indies to get a little bit of sun or something like that for
No.
vacation.
Yeah, it was
deep economic ties there.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was an economic ties. So to go back to your question, how much of Lyme's economy depended on trade with the West Indies, the sugar trade? I think most of it directly or indirectly. That was, the fishermen were catching fish that would be salted and shipped as food for slaves in the 19th century, and horses, all kinds of agricultural products and crops, barrel staves. All of these products were being sent out, and oftentimes it was a barter system. They were exchanged for sugar or rum. They weren't bringing in cash. The question always is, were they bringing in slaves directly into Lyme? And my answer is maybe not. I haven't seen any evidence that they were, but we certainly can't rule it out.
Yeah. And somehow those individuals arrived here. Whether through New London, whether through Middletown, whether through some other means, they got here somehow.
Yeah, or Boston, or
Boston, right?
actually, several slaves you'll find if you look over, enslaved records, the records of enslavement in Connecticut. A lot of them are named Boston. Was that because they came from there, or not?
Yeah.
We don't know. Maybe it was just popular as a slave name. But anyway, there are several Bostons.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it makes it likely. All right, so if you will, tell me another story about some of the individuals you've discovered. So we have this cluster up around Sill Lane on Upper Lyme Street, as you call it. You've got the individual Jack, I think his name was, who would have been around where the library is at this point, right?
No, I'm sorry, I confused you. Jack is Joseph Peck Jr.'s hired person, a servant man. He's called his servant man. So he was on Upper Lyme Street. And I don't know of any slaves that John Huntley had. He was the one who had his hosted on the side of the library. I've never seen a record. That doesn't mean he didn't have them, but it does, like Thomas Anderson. I don't know for sure, but there are no records that I or anyone else has found.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me some other individuals that have captured your attention, or some of the stories that you've discovered.
Sure. Why don't I? There are so many that I can range around the town because there were
Yeah.
many people enslaved here over 150 years. I'd like to start with Moses, who wasn't the earliest slave for whom we have a record, the
Mm,
earliest slave in Lyme for whom we have a record. He appeared in a New London court with his owner, Richard Ely, in, I think it was June or May of 1670. That's
mm,
quite early. Remember, Moses Noyes came as a minister in 1666, and Lyme didn't separate from Saybrook until 1675. So it's very early in our history, earlier than other towns in the area. And that's a fascinating story because it stretches in so many directions. Moses was the slave of Richard Ely, and Richard Ely himself is interesting. He was the wealthiest person, as far as I can tell, in Lyme at the time. He came here a few years earlier. We don't have the exact date, but in 1668, he was Lyme's townsman or first selectman. So he was considered to be an important personage. And he owned a vast tract of land called 6 Mile Island Farm. And Six
mm,
Mile Island Farm is at the end of what today is Ely's Ferry Road. It's now just above the Old Lyme boundary, and it stretches from the Neck Road to the river. And Richard Ely acquired this land, and that's why the story is so fascinating. He acquired the land through his second or third wife, maybe third wife, and her name was Elizabeth Culloch, and she was, before she married John Culloch, she was the sister of George Fenwick. Now I'm taking you back and back. But you probably have heard of Fenwick Point in Saybrook. George Fenwick was the early governor of the Saybrook colony. And when he returned to England permanently, he gave at his death all of his land in the Lyme area to his sister. And Richard Ely arrived in Boston sometime around 1660, and he snapped up the recently widowed um, Elizabeth Fenwick Culloch and married her and brought her to Lyme. And so through his wife and through his wife's brother, he acquired this very, very large farm and tract of land at the end of what's now Ely's Ferry Road. So the history of the land is important. And just to pick up on my network discussion from earlier, when Richard Ely came to Lyme, when Richard Ely came first to Boston from Plymouth, England, he brought with him one son named Richard, and he sent a second son named William Ely to Barbados.
mm,
And so we have a shipping record from Richard Ely in 1658, shortly before he came to Boston, when he sent out a ship from London to Madeira, the Cape Verde Islands, Barbados, and then back to London. So we know that Richard Ely, before arriving in Boston, was a shipping agent or shipping merchant in
mm,
England. So he had a vast or an established network of contacts, apparently did continued trading in Boston, married Elizabeth, his wife, moved to Old Lyme in around 1663 or 4, became the town selectman, and is called into court summoned to the New London court with his slave Moses in 1670. It's a fascinating story. So if you take each piece, you find another part of the puzzle. And for our conversation, the reason that Richard Ely with Moses and also with Elizabeth, his wife, the reason the three of them were summoned to the court was that he had profaned the Sabbath. It was mandated by law that everyone observe the Sabbath. That meant no work on the Sabbath and also attending Sabbath services in the meeting house. Richard Ely apparently didn't do that. And that surprised me, because if he's the wealthiest person in town, and if 2 years before he's been the first selectman, wouldn't you think that he would be going to church? But apparently he didn't, and maybe many others didn't also. That's just my bringing my assumptions that if it was the law, everybody did it. Well, no, Richard Ely didn't. And probably Moses was called to court to testify about what his owner or master had been doing on that Sabbath day when he should have been in the meeting house. So I thought that detail tells us something else about early Lyme that I wouldn't otherwise have known.
So, any idea about, do we have any information about Moses as an individual, apart from his name, apart from where he may have resided? And
Nothing at all. It's interesting, perhaps coincidental, that his name Moses is the same as the name of the newly arrived minister, Moses Noyes. That could be a coincidence or not. And there's a property record for Richard Lord 3 years later in 1673 that itemizes on his farm 2 Negroes. So maybe there were 2 already in 1670, but 3 years later there were 2. That's all that I know about Moses. Did he come from Boston? Possibly. It wouldn't be unlikely. Maybe Richard Ely brought him when he came from Boston, or he could easily have acquired him here. It was possible, but there weren't many enslaved Africans in Connecticut, in the Connecticut colony that early.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. So yeah, we're ranging across not only space now, but also time.
Yes,
In
that's
that,
right.
these are different, not quite eras we're talking about, but different decades we're talking about between, say,
Right.
Jane and Moses. You mentioned at one point that you've documented 160 named slaves in the history of Old Lyme. Is that right?
Right, I think that was in September when I had just done a count through my
Mhm.
files, and that's an approximation. I'm not sure it's absolutely correct to the letter. And the other thing that's confusing is that slaves here and elsewhere often shared the same first name. So there are many Jacks, and there are many Caesars, and many Warwicks, and so on, Pompeys. And it's going to take some more checking for me to be sure that I'm not counting the same person twice. But I did find 160 named slaves, and a lot of times the slaves listed in records, probate records or land records, are not named. So that means there were more than that.
Yeah.
But yes, that's how many we can name. And now in this era, it's important to name the names, to not just
Okay.
have in our minds the fact that James Huntley had a manservant, but to be able to name that manservant and to give him some individuality, some authenticity,
Right.
apart from the item in the public record.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just think about 100. All right, look, I mean, the numbers are approximate in some ways. I mean, it could be that you're counting some individuals twice. There could be a great many more, but we're talking about 160 just for this tiny region. I mean, this is a tiny, tiny region of the state. And to me, it just speaks volumes that just within this local vicinity, there are that many individuals, and then multiply that across the entirety of the state, and it's a fairly monumental number.
Yes.
Um, I don't know what it would be exactly, but it's not insignificant.
Let me tell you a story, a happier story,
Okay.
a kinder story, because we do have those also. And I think it's very important to realize that the experience of enslavement, what little we know about it, wasn't consistent. Some people baptized their slaves. Some of them taught them to read and write. Some people didn't. We know very little about it, but we know enough to know that there was variety. But I want to give you a story that's a little bit touching, and that is that we have a personal, this is now I'm jumping ahead in time. We know quite a bit about the enslaved people who were held by members of the Noyes family, from Reverend Noyes on down, to multiple generations, at least 4 generations of the family, all of them on Lime Street, because they kept records. They not only kept records, but they preserved records. So it's important to remember when we talk about this topic that there are many records that weren't kept. The births and deaths of enslaved people weren't noted anywhere, and there are many records that were lost. How many other merchants, not just Joseph Peck Jr., had account books and so on? But I'm just going to talk about what we know. And this is rare. This is one of the moments at which we can almost hear an enslaved person speak, which is why I mention it, because what we know about those enslaved comes entirely from the records of others, their owners, or records about their owners. But this record gives us a little bit of a glimpse into another facet of the experience of the enslaved. In the Noyes family households, there were many slaves. And in 1832, a woman named Jenny responds to the death of one of her 5 children. And that child's name is Prince. And the former slave named Prince, dies in the household of the town doctor. The town doctor's name is Richard Noyes, Dr. Richard Noyes. And in his household live um, people of color. They were called free colored persons or free blacks at that point, people of color who had formerly been enslaved. Because now I'm talking about 1832. In 1820, the last enslaved person in Lyme that I know of, also a Noyes slave, was
Sorry about that. That was me. Keep
good.
going. Good.
So Jenny, the letter is from Daniel Rogers Noyes, who lived in the house next to the present church. Some of you will know his name because he's married to Phoebe Griffin Noyes, and she's famous because the library is named after her. And Daniel Rogers Noyes writes a letter to his cousin, whose name is Matthew Noyes, and Matthew Noyes is the minister in Brantford. And Daniel is just telling Matthew about the death of Prince. The letter is about, I want to inform you that in your cousin's household, Prince died this week. And it explains in some detail the death of Prince. He was fine a few days before. The doctor didn't know that there was anything wrong with him. He had been down sitting by the fire in the kitchen earlier in the morning, and that afternoon he died quite unexpectedly. And the letter also says that Jenny is deeply grieved to have lost so many of her children because others of her children have died before Prince. So we have a picture here. We have that letter in the archives at the Florence Whistle Museum, so we can look at it and read it. And and it's on actually one of the. I posted it on in one of the articles that I wrote about Noyes family slaves on the history blog for the museum. So you can look at it as well. But it gives us a glimpse that after slavery ended, enslavement ended in Lyme. Some free blacks, some of the formerly enslaved, stayed on in the households of the families that they had served. And some of them didn't, of course, but some of them had been so accustomed to that situation that they stayed on, and they continued to be fed, housed, clothed, and cared for. And in this case, given some kind of medical care by Dr. Richard Noyes. So both the expression of Jenny's grief, the fact that Daniel Rogers Noyes wants to write about this incident of the former slave Prince's death in so much detail to the cousin in Brantford, and sort of setting the stage of Prince having been down sitting by the fire the morning before or the morning of, I don't quite remember the details, his death, I think gives us a slightly different picture of what some of the circumstances of enslavement were like.
Yeah. No, that's a touching story. I mean, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the glimmer of humanity. I guess that there were those who evidently were able to recognize and respect the humanity of those who had been enslaved. Being as it may, yeah, it's still a tragic history, but
Yes.
I'm grateful that there is that recognition of humanity there. Tell me, you were going to you talked about your own family history a little bit, and of course I can't talk about my family history here. I don't go back that far, but I do live in a house that has a long history, and I'm wondering if you can shed some light on that, on the parsonage and what its history may have been.
Yes, Steve, I wanted to talk about that as well. So if we move from Upper Lime Street down to Lower Lime Street to the site of the church, the meeting house right now, and to the house in which you live, that house was built sometime around 1784 by Samuel Mather Jr. Samuel Mather Jr. was the wealthiest at that time merchant in the town, and an earlier church historian, Susan Hollingsworth Ely, who wrote the earlier book on the church history, has written a wonderful pamphlet called The Parsonage, in which she calls Samuel Mather Jr. Lyme's merchant prince. And she includes in that pamphlet the inventory in his warehouses at the time he died in 1809. And it's mind-blowing. There were purple silk scarves and green silk scarves and silk gloves and silk stockings and all kinds of teas and all of these luxury goods and luxury items of women's apparel, as well as farm implements and tools and bulk dry goods, as in cloth of different sorts and so on. So she's also listed all of Samuel Mather's vessels. I think he owned, I did count the ones, I think it's 13 or so that she itemizes their names and when they were launched and where they were built, many of them in the shipyard on the Lieutenant River that was run by the Hill brothers, Samuel Hill and Edward Hill, the site now of well, it's where Ted Hamilton lives, if any of you know where that house is, on the south side of Ferry Road before the Lieutenant River. At any rate, Samuel, that was where Samuel Mather's ships were built. He acquired the warehouses that John McCurdy had built and owned on the Lieutenant River. Mather acquired them with his partners. And so we know that he did a big business. We can tell from his inventory that, wow, there's a lot of stuff there. Where it all came from, some of it seems to have come from China, all the different kinds of tea, but the China trade hadn't really well, I don't know. That's another subject. I won't get into that right now. What about the house? The house was built in 1784, and the 1790 census tells us that Samuel Mather Jr. had in his household 4 slaves. We know nothing at all about the slaves that Samuel Mather owned. Who were they? Where did they come from? What happened to them? Except for one. In his will, the same will in which all of these, the same probate papers in which all of these items are listed, the luxury items I just mentioned, he also names a slave, Jack. And he leaves Jack to his son, James Mather, who acquires the house and acquires this one enslaved person. So I think we can probably assume that that's 1809, that Jack might have been one of the 4 slaves in 1790. That's 19 years earlier. We can't know for sure, but we don't, the point is that we know the names of none, at least I so far know the names of none of the people enslaved in that household. Who were they? Where did they come from? I can imagine what they did. I imagine they worked as, stevedores, basically moving those goods in and out of the warehouses, as well as doing agricultural labor. They must have. And that's interesting to speculate. They may have gone, even James might have gone to sea, because next door in John McCurdy's house, one of his enslaved people, whose name was Caesar. And Caesar, we have the birth record of Caesar, and we know Caesar ran away in 1784, something like that, around that date. So about the same time that Samuel Mather is building the house, in the runaway notice, it says that Caesar had been to sea. So it's very possible that Jack might also have been to sea. He could have been a deckhand. And there's a wonderful book written, some years ago now, but relatively recent, called Black Jacks, which talks about the experience of New England Blacks who served on vessels in one sort or another, who were mariners. So that's something to think about. Jack might have gone to sea, maybe not. He might have been acquired after 1790. I don't know. But I think that the biggest thing I want to leave you with is that we really know nothing about the people who were enslaved in your house. Maybe Jack was one. He would have been by 1809, but in 1790, don't know. We don't know. I don't know how old Jack was in 1809. So I think, it's just so important to not jump to conclusions and to not ascribe to the situation, the circumstances of enslavement, details that we don't know. That slaves were auctioned on the main street of Saybrook, where they were ridden in carts in handcuffs on the Boston Post Road. I mean, all of these things make the story seem sort of sensational and so on, but we don't have any of those details. And I think it's a disservice now, especially when the truth is so embattled and we need to all agree on the same reality. We need to get back to the documentary truth, and then we can speculate. I can speculate that Temperance was Jane's mother and say, I don't know for sure, but I think it's a logical conclusion. But I think these broader sort of inferences and legends and traditions that have grown up about the slaves in your attic, which is a tradition that I've heard a number of times, are ones that we have to be just a little wary about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, whether or not we ascribe truth to those particular stories or not, I think the details we have are damning enough. I mean, that we know there were 4 enslaved people who lived here. That's enough to chill us, frankly.
Yes.
There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about that. Walking around the floors of this house, it's a piece of the history, and it's something that I feel like I have to grapple with as a resident, but that we all have to grapple with. And where they slept, what their names might have been, it would be interesting if details came to light. But I don't think that changes the basic essential fact that there were 4 enslaved people here.
Yes.
And we do know that much. Now, here's a question that you may or may not be able to answer, but it's something I wonder sometimes. Who would have done the construction on a house like this in 1784? Would it have been Samuel Mather himself? Would it have been like hired laborers, or would it have been his enslaved African Americans at that point?
I wonder about that a lot. Who built the church? We know who the
That's
master
right.
builder was, but who were the craftspeople, or who built
Who did the work?
any of these houses?
That's right.
Certainly in the earlier period, the sons of the owner would have been most likely involved in the labor, unless it was someone like Reverend Noyes' sons. He had two sons. One became a doctor. One was the town clerk and a justice of the peace. Whether that Moses Noyes Jr. actually helped with agricultural labor or manual labor, trade and crafts, and what way he helped, we just can't know. With Samuel Mather's house, it's just impossible to know. I have never read of enslaved African Americans working in shipyards in Lyme or nearby towns. I know that the only thing I know is that Daniel Sterling, who had an early shipyard on the Lieutenant River, did have in his inventory a slave, and Daniel Sterling also owned a sawmill and a number of apple orchards and properties. So what that slave did, whether he helped with the construction of vessels in the shipyard, I don't know. Same with Samuel Hill's shipyard. I've never heard of it or read or even seen the slightest, hint that there were blacks working there, and that's maybe something that would cause us not to be terribly positive in our thinking, because maybe enslaved blacks weren't given the resources to learn skilled trades. I don't know that. So that made their situation difficult after they were freed and when they were freed, because they didn't have anything they could fall back on. We know of a few who were shoemakers or blacksmiths. Those are the two that I've read about most commonly. Most were agricultural laborers, and women, after they were enslaved, would do laundry or work in kitchens. But that's all that I've seen
Yeah.
documented. So I've never seen that. For example, we would think that if the enslaved blacks had worked as carpenters and had used tools and had worked in shipyards, that perhaps you would see evidence that after enslavement they would continue in those professions. And I've never seen that, which makes me wonder if perhaps they didn't have those skills.
Yeah,
So
that's a good
who,
point.
was he using was Mother hiring? We don't know who built his house, but was he hiring, white laborers, workers, skilled carpenters? Probably. Who built the church? Probably, maybe. I just don't know. I wish I could answer. Some
Right,
things I
right,
just have
right.
to say I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Whether or not it was skilled labor, it's hard for me to believe that with captive laborers around, that they would not have been in some way a part of the construction,
Yes.
whether hauling materials,
Yes.
whatever it might be.
Oh, I think for sure hauling the materials, no question about that. I thought you meant the actual building, the carpentry, the skilled
Well, that
carpentry.
too.
But
That
hauling
too.
the materials, I would say almost certainly, yes. And we do have some documents, a few that show that there's one, for example, one notebook that I'm remembering, that the master builder of the church, the fourth church on the present site, had lumber hauled from New London or something, or timbers or something that involved a black laborer. So I think that part's true. The heavy labor, maybe the quarrying of the stone,
Right.
all sorts of things would have been done by, and there may be other scholars who have more information about this than I do. So don't take my information as the last word, but from what I've read, which is quite a lot about this area, that I haven't found that yet.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. So listen, we need to bring this conversation to a close. But I wanted to just conclude by asking what you ultimately make of these stories. And I guess what I mean by that is, what sort of responsibility do you think we have now that we know these stories? What does that mean um, for how we conduct our lives, for the present? What does the present owe the past, or what does the past, knowing these stories about the past, what responsibility do we carry forward?
Yes, I think that's really a wonderful question, Stephen. A great place to end. What's happened is that somehow, and it's important how the somehow is important. Somehow, this information has been edited out of our history. It's not that it didn't exist; it's there, but it's been edited out. It's not that you can't find these documents in the land records, but you only find usually what you look for. And if you look, I said this to you once before, but in Samuel Mather's house, if you look in the parlor and find all the fine furniture, that's what you'll know about Samuel Mather. But if you look in, elsewhere at these possibilities that we've just been discussing, you learn about other things. So I'd like to mention that in 1876, when America was celebrating its centennial, it was a big deal in Old Lyme, and there was a huge, a really huge. By that I mean a large exhibition that was held to honor the centennial in 1876. And a woman in the church named Ellen Noyes Chadwick, who is a descendant of fifth generation, I think, descendant of Reverend Noyes, and a keeper of the family history, read in church. We have the letter in our files. She read in church a letter asking people in the church to provide for this exhibition things that they had, things that were in their attics, things that demonstrated and documented the past. And one of the things that she contributed was a teapot. And the teapot was owned by the woman Jenny, whom I talked about a few moments ago, whose son Prince had died and was mentioned in the letter. And there's a very interesting article in the Hartford Courant in September 1876, in which the reporter comes down and he describes this big exhibition in Old Lyme and all the things that were there and all the fine people that were commemorated and whose history and good deeds and importance and prominence could be documented through the exhibition. But he also mentions the teapot, not just Evelyn Salisbury's fine china, which was there, but also this simple teapot. And he says that it was owned by old Black Jenny, which I'm sure Ellen told him, and that she was called a good Christian woman, which I've seen in two of Ellen's letters. So Jenny was called Old Black Jenny, and she was said to be a good Christian woman. And she left a teapot, and she also left some articles of knitting. But the teapot was in this exhibition, and the Hartford Courant reporter, adds a little note. And he says it's very important to use this teapot as a reminder that many of the early settlers in Connecticut were slave owners. That was in 1876. So sometime between then and now, we've forgotten. That information is no longer something that we were reminded of because I never learned about that. So my view is that now history is perhaps as important as it's ever been. If I could go back and redo my own career and my own education, I would study history because it seems to provide us with so much essential information about who we are and therefore maybe where we can hope to be going. But it does seem to me that now that we know about the history of enslavement here, and now that we have at least some avenues to pursue and some documents to provide us with concrete evidence of what did happen and documents that help us to perhaps speculate a little bit about what might have happened, that we do have that obligation, the responsibility to restore the history that has somehow been edited out and been forgotten. It has been lost, but it can be recovered and it can be restored. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I know others in many communities are trying to do. And that's why I'm grateful that you're moving along on this journey with me. I think it's very important.
Yeah. Well, that's a great answer. That's a great. I think that's a great place to bring this conversation to a conclusion. So I'll say once again, thank you not only for sharing some of this information and some of these stories, but thank you for doing the work, visiting the archives and learning what you have and filling in some of these lost and forgotten histories and details. I think it's heroic labor. So thank you.
Good. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there it is. It may well be that Carolyn and I have further conversations in the future because this is ongoing research. But for now, we'll wrap this one up. Thanks again to Carolyn, but thanks to all of you for watching this, and be well, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I hope you know how deeply cared for all of you are out there, from all of us in our church community. Love to all of you in this ongoing time of Corona. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.